Namaste, everybody. This is Rishi here. I hope you all are doing wonderful and great, and you're staying safe and healthy. I just wanted to read with you a blog that I wrote a long time ago. It's called Sadness and Spirituality. This is for anyone who's dealt with troubles, hardships, sadness, depression, whether it be due to any kind of loss or tragedy. I hope this helps you, and I hope that this message reaches out to you. Thank you. Without further ado, I'll start reading. It's called Sadness and Spirituality. There is a lot of beauty and love in this world, but unfortunately, the opposite rings true as well. One of the Buddha's first teachings is that life has its suffering. There is joy and happiness, but it is temporary and fleeting. While we all face calamities, we get sick, we age, we decay, and eventually die. No matter how strong a person is, if he or she lives long enough, he or she will experience sadness and grief. There are definitely justifiable reasons to grieve, such as the loss of a loved one, a breakup, depression, trauma and abuse, physical, mental, and or spiritual pain, etc. The list goes on. When it comes to grief from external material causes, such as mental pain or an injury, it is your duty to use applicable science and seek professional help to take care of your health. It is okay to pray to whatever higher power you wish to worship, and for some, prayer does help. The placebo effect is real. The power of prayer, positivity, and faith does have healing effects. But understand that the higher power blessed doctors and therapists with science to treat wounds. I know it sounds kind of weird, but when people are in pain, they get closer to God because they surrendered their ego and power to the universe. Those that suffer the most, ironically, are the closest to God and the higher power. That is why spiritual people tend to suffer a lot, and a lot of people who suffer become spiritual, empathetic, and kind-hearted, because they don't wish that same pain upon anybody else. When you suffer a lot, you start to think deeply, how you would relive your life if you weren't in pain, what your priorities are, and you eventually surrender your ego to the higher power and universe, whatever you wish to call it. When we are also in grief and sadness, sometimes angels will come in the forms of humans or creatures to aid and help you. The dark wound is where God's light shines through. Regardless, I understand that some people go through serious pain. All I can say is that pain, like joy, is impermanent. Pain comes in our life for a reason, sometimes to warn us, teach us a lesson, and make us get closer to God. Pain and suffering are the most powerful teachers, which teach us to get out of the cycle of samsara, or the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth in the material world, and that this material planet is not our original home. Pain and suffering exist to remind us that our duty as humans is to achieve self and God realization, which are one and the same. Spiritual knowledge from the majority of traditions testify that the soul or consciousness never dies and is eternal, and that all material phenomena is impermanent. If you want to understand grief as a material phenomenon, then you will have to accept that grief and sadness are also impermanent. You cannot always be happy, and you cannot always be sad. However, how do we cope with our suffering and grief? While sometimes we have to cry and wallow in our misery, it helps when we have spiritual knowledge and awareness. Both my grandmother and best friend died recently, and I definitely cried when I heard of both of their passings. However, with the proper spiritual knowledge and understanding that their true identity is this spirit, soul, consciousness, or subject, and that the consciousness never dies, I'm in much better peace knowing that they truly aren't dead, and that they are just traveling their eternal journey in a better place. Their true self, the subject, is eternal, while the object or body is impermanent and transfers form. Energy can never be created nor destroyed, it can only transfer form. When we become too attached to the material world, and mistaken it for the only true identity and reality, we suffer a lot. We need to start identifying people as subjects or eternal consciousness and souls, and not just only objects. I'm not saying to give up objectivity altogether, but prioritize the subject, the soul, the consciousness, which is eternal and immortal. Shifting our priority from objective to subjective can reduce a lot of mental and spiritual suffering, such as having the understanding that we are all immortal souls in consciousness, and that suffering and grief is temporary as well as one of the greatest teachers. Regardless, it is perfectly okay to be unhappy and even cry sometimes. We get frustrated when reality doesn't collaborate with our expectations, hopes, and desires. God gave us tears to cry both out of sadness and out of joy. What we also need to realize is that we are literally parts and parcels of God in the universe. Our joys and our pains are literally the same as God's. When we are crying, God is also crying. When we are laughing, God is also laughing. Get into the habit of seeing everyone as a divine subject or consciousness energy of God, and that all of our troubles, worries, pains, and joys ultimately belong to God. We need to surrender our egos and understand that everything goes according to divine plan, even if we don't like it or understand it at first. Grief and negative emotions can also be catalyzed and fuel for creativity. Some of the greatest actors, celebrities, artists, musicians, authors, and successful people have all been affected by sadness and grief in some shape or way, and used grief and suffering as a vehicle for self-expression. I highly recommend for people who are struggling with mental illness and or grief to tap into their creative and artistic energies, whether it be through singing, writing, acting, painting, dancing, etc. When dealing with grief, it is okay to be sad and cry, but it is more important to realize that it is impermanent. Sometimes you have to let it all out and just cry and wallow in your despair, and sometimes grief does last for a while, because if I'm being real with you, sometimes sad shit happens. However, if I'm being real with you as well, then good shit also happens. Such is the circle of life. It is a yin-yang. The strongest and most successful people are those who endure grief and hardships, yet transform it into something meaningful and beautiful. Whoever is reading this, or listening to this, I pray that the divine universe will aid you on your journey and relieve you from grief and pain. May the universe, source, God, the highest power, bless you all. Thank you. So yeah, that was my blog. I'm gonna upload a lot more blogs in the future, so keep tuned. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope that this reflection on sadness and grief helped you out. Thank you.